banter?
What's banter?
About what?
All right, well, we'll get started. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third edition of Between Two Lamps, which is the Bridge Initiative's live web conversation where we sit in our windowless office here at Georgetown University and attempt to shed more light on Islamophobia.
Yes, welcome. We are live streaming on both Facebook and Twitter, and we hope that you'll send us your questions so that we can address them during the Q&A portion of the show, and you can do that through our Twitter handle, which is bridge @bridgeinit, I-N-I-T. So that's @bridgeinit. It's right here behind Jordan. And if you tweet about the conversation, please do be sure to use the hashtag #BetweenTwoLamps, which is right here.
So before we begin the conversation, I want to make sure we introduce the members of our team who are on both sides of the camera for this session. I'm Jordan Duffner, a Bridge researcher. This is Nathan Lean, our research director. And behind the camera is our senior researcher and social media guru, Nazir Harb, and our program coordinator, Kristen Shakirji, is heading up our first big, what's the Snapchat? Snapchat.
It's our Snapchat
session.
debut, yeah.
Yeah, Snapchat debut. And we also want to wish all of our Muslim viewers a Ramadan Mubarak. So have a blessed Ramadan. We hope you have a wonderful month of fun times and meaningful moments with your family and friends. So we're going to start the conversation today by talking a bit about Muhammad Ali, who, as I'm sure everyone knows, passed away earlier this week. So I'm going to let you start by talking about him and how, his death and the conversations since his death have actually related a little bit to Islamophobia.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's a lot to talk about. Muhammad Ali, the greatest, as he was called, passed away on Friday of last week at the age of 74. He'd been battling Parkinson's disease for some time. And there's been a lot said about him in the days since his passing. Him as a boxer, as a man, as an American Muslim. And so, it is really, I think, interesting, even in this sort of climate of Islamophobia, that the world really, and especially Americans, are sort of collectively mourning the passing of a man named Muhammad.
Yeah.
And that's, there's something to be said about that, and we shouldn't take it lightly. Ali was the quintessential American, and as CNN's Daniel Burke, who runs the religion blog, they're called him the greatest American Muslim, and I think there are plenty of people that would probably agree with that. So he was, of course, a hero, fearless in the ring, persistent and devoted to being the best that he could at his sport, boxing, reveling in victory. But he was also a proud follower of Islam, a proud Muslim, and very vocal about his faith, very unapologetic about his decision to convert to the religion of Islam, especially at a time when that was even less popular, I think, than it would be today.
Yeah.
So there's a lot here to talk about in terms of how he was a standard bearer, not just for American Muslims, but also for Americans of all walks of life and of all religious backgrounds. An example, really, of what this country can be and should be. But that said, there were some odd reactions, right, to his passing, and I think it's important to point those out within the context of a conversation about Islamophobia. So some wanted to praise his athletic ability and say that he was, the greatest boxer. They wanted to salute his status as a hero, but while doing that, dismissed his religious identity, or wanted to sort of brush over it, or point to various things that he had said at one point or other in his life, which felt kind of odd, in a time that most people were celebrating and mourning this guy, to kind of take shots at him. And the chief of taking shots, Donald Trump, was one who kind of, I guess, set into motion what later became a flurry of other sort of negative tweets and things on social media. So Donald Trump tweeted, and I'll read the tweet here, quote, "Muhammad Ali is dead at 74, exclamation point. A truly great champion and a wonderful guy. He will be missed by all," end quote. It was odd to me that he used an exclamation point after Muhammad Ali is dead at 74. I don't know why he'd do that, but more importantly, I think about that tweet is that Donald Trump in December tweeted something that was especially problematic And it came in response to President Obama's remarks that Muslims were our heroes. They were our, they had, they'd served their country. There were athletes among them, entertainers and others, trying to point to the diversity of the American Muslim experience.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump said in December, and I'll read this quote, Obama said in his speech that Muslims are our sports heroes. What sport is he talking about, and who? Is Obama profiling? So obviously this is quite odd, because Muhammad Ali is recognized as probably, it is the most recognized Muslim, I think, athlete, certainly. And so, there's a quite a bit of hypocrisy there in Donald Trump's statement. And, he was roundly criticized on Twitter, on Facebook, and even in mainstream media for making that comment.
Well, the juxtaposition of the tweets was really interesting because I read his exclamation point at the end of the recent tweet as sort of like a shocked, like, oh wow, he's passed away, I can't believe it. And I was glad to see that he was praising the career of this person. But yeah, has he forgotten that he's Muslim, and that's which was a huge part of his public identity. And I think it just underscores a point that other people have made, that Donald Trump will use kind of anti-Muslim fervor in the public to gain attention, or he'll propose anti-Muslim policies, but either is unaware of how ingrained Muslims are in society, or just forgets, or there's an interesting kind of dichotomy or contradiction in those tweets. And I was glad to see so many people pointed it out. I saw your tweet first when you pointed out the sort of the gulf between these two ideas that he had expressed on Twitter, and then everyone else started pointing it out too. So I think that was a really interesting conversation to watch unfold.
Yeah, and Bernie Sanders, also a presidential candidate, had kind of an interesting remark to make about it. And I don't exactly recall now precisely what he said, but it was something along the lines of, you can't mourn the loss of someone like Ali and say great things about him while also disparaging Muslims, and pointing to the fact that Muhammad Ali's identity as an American Muslim was central to who he was as a person, and just I think further sort of critiquing the hypocrisy of a statement like Trump and others. It is important to note that Muhammad Ali, prior to his passing, of course, back in December, I believe it was, responded to Trump when Trump declared that Muslims should be banned from immigrating to the United States. And for those of you who don't know this, I'll read the quote. It's quite interesting. Muhammad Ali wrote, quote, "I am a Muslim, and there's nothing Islamic about killing innocent people in Paris, San Bernardino, or anywhere else in the world. True Muslims know that ruthless violence of so-called Islamic jihadists goes against the very tenets of our religion," end quote. And so that was a very poignant expression by someone who was a champion in many regards.
And that was said specifically in response to the Muslim ban, right?
Specifically in response to the Muslim ban. In fact, it was posted somewhere, I believe maybe on social media or on his website, and the headline referenced Trump and the call to ban Muslim immigration. But Trump was not the only one that took the opportunity to sort of critique Muhammad Ali following his passing. Piers Morgan, who was formerly, I think, CNN anchor for, several years, I believe, but certainly a mainstream media commentator, said on Twitter, Muhammad Ali said far more inflammatory, racist things about white people than Donald Trump has ever said about Muslims. And so, there's sort of an odd, first of all, the timing about that struck me as being very odd and inappropriate, but even more than that, comparing Muhammad Ali to Donald Trump is kind of bizarre too. And furthermore, there's this insistence, it seems, to, even in his death, seek to sort of undermine his character, to delegitimize him, to attack him. Muhammad Ali, to my knowledge, never advocated banning an entire religious group from entering the United States.
Well, we also know that, while he initially became Muslim in the Nation of Islam, he sort of moved to a Orthodox Sunni
Right.
Interpretation of Islam later in life, which rejected some of the the more like racially charged aspects of the Nation of Islam's view of the civil rights issues
Yeah.
and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tennessee State Representative Daniel Martin also referred to him as Cassius Clay, which I thought was a sort of swipe at his Muslim identity, as if to sort of delegitimize him and his desire to be known as Muhammad Ali.
It's funny you bring that up, because one observation that I had in watching the coverage and everything was thinking back on a conversation that happened at my Thanksgiving table one year, where a relative, somehow Muhammad Ali came up, and one of my relatives said, he'll always be Cassius Clay.
Right.
And there's almost this aversion to having someone who we respect so much be Muslim.
Right.
Because so many people still see Islam as other, as not something American. And it makes them uncomfortable when someone who is like quintessentially American is Muslim.
Right.
And we forget that there are so many athletes in particular who are Muslim who are very famous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Including Shaquille O'Neal and people
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Yeah, people that are really well loved and very much in the limelight now. So
yeah, and Muhammad Ali said regarding Cassius Clay, he said, "That's my slave name." So there's almost this tendency to want to identify him by his slave name rather than his Muslim name, and that's I think very problematic. But moving forward, because we don't want to focus on one topic for the duration of this Twitter sesh, and we want to also balance the negative with other positives. So Jordan's going to talk for a minute about interfaith responses to Islamophobia, based on an article that you wrote several weeks ago for The Bridge.
Yeah, so one of the articles that we published on the Bridge website a couple weeks ago looked at different responses to Islamophobia that have been undertaken by non-Muslims, so Christians, Jews, others, and in the week since, more responses have come to our attention also. So I wanted to use the opportunity today to bring up some of those other responses to Islamophobia from different religious groups and communities. But first, I'll mention a couple that we mentioned in the piece itself. So we noticed that a lot of groups and coalitions of different religious denominations are speaking out against Islamophobia, whether it's through statements, public actions. For example, there was an event called Beyond Tolerance at the National Cathedral last fall. And a lot of these efforts are really focused on Americans' response to the refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, and looking at how Islamophobia shapes our response and saying, looking at particularly for Christians and Jews, their sort of tenet of welcoming the stranger and saying, are we living this out if we're only wanting to accept certain refugees and things like that. So that was one thing we observed. There are also coalitions of religious groups that are even pushing for legislation. So we saw a big coalition come together around legislation that would make Donald Trump's Muslim ban illegal, that you can't have a religious test for entry into the United States. And it seems kind of like a no-brainer. We'll see. I don't know if this will go to the floor or what the outcome will be, but it's another way of making a statement to say that this is not in line with American values, but also not in line with the religious values of these different groups. And then the last thing, which relates a lot to the month of Ramadan, are interfaith meals, sharing meals with Muslims. And we've seen a lot of initiatives to welcome Muslims, especially for iftar, the fast-breaking meal, into churches and synagogues and other places to combat Islamophobia just with food and friendship and getting to know people. And then a couple other sort of singular groups and initiatives that I wanted to highlight that have come on my radar in the last couple of weeks are some of these. So Fuller Seminary, which is a Christian seminary, has started having events around Muslim-Christian relations and helping to teach their seminarians and students about Islam. And one of the heads of that tweeted at me. He said, we also, for the first time, created a break in our program so that Muslims could pray. So trying to extend this hospitality, and I thought that was a really positive step, and it was great that someone reached out to us and let us know about that. Another one is these signs that the Minnesota Council of Churches is offering for houses of worship or for private homes, and they say "Blessed Ramadan," or wishing our Muslim neighbors a blessed Ramadan. And these signs are free. You can donate, to cover shipping costs and things like that. But if you go to blessedramadan.org, it actually takes you to the Minnesota Council of Churches website, and I think it's kind of gutsy and unexpected for a Christian organization to have Ramadan in their URL or to buy that up and use it for something like this. So that was cool to see.
Yeah.
There were also a number of Catholic advocacy groups last week that released a pretty strong statement against Islamophobia, and I'll just read a couple of quotations from that. They wrote, "We hear from our Muslim sisters and brothers about how difficult it is to be an American Muslim today, and we lament the bigotry and Islamophobia coming from some politicians and commentators during the 2016 presidential election cycle." And then they say, "Now is the time for all Americans, especially people of faith, to speak out and build friendships with our Muslim neighbors." And there's a long list of Catholic organizations that have signed on to this. A lot of them work on social justice issues. For example, Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good, Faith and Public Life's Catholic Program, the Franciscan Action Network, the Ignatian Solidarity Network, the LCWR, which is the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, which got a lot of attention over sort of the tension with the Vatican over some of their activities.
Right.
People will remember that. Network, which is the group that sent the nuns on the bus, and Pax Christi, which is an international Catholic organization. So those are just some of the many groups that signed on to this. And then the last one, that I wanted to mention, is the American Sikh community, who, even outside the context of Ramadan, and even before Islamophobia was a big national issue, really has been an ally to the American Muslim community. And that's really tough because they arguably are targeted even more than American Muslims in Islamophobic hate crimes and attacks. And they did a wonderful job in a Daily Show feature that was a couple weeks ago, saying, we're not going to throw our Muslim neighbors under the bus.
Right.
We could say, oh, no, we're not Muslim, don't hate us. But instead, they're saying, no, we're going to stick with you. And I think that's really admirable, when it would be easy to just run away.
Yeah.
So those are some positive examples of lots of different kinds of people that are working to end Islamophobia.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this is that it's not only something that seems like the right thing to do morally. It's not only simply a benevolent act, but it also is very practical in terms of combating Islamophobia.
Mm-hmm.
The more visible these kinds of coalitions are, when you see groups from different religious backgrounds coming together with one another, coming together with the Muslim community to say, hey, look, we're not going to accept this. That has really, I think, the potential to communicate to the sort of broader American population that this is a problem and that there are plenty of people willing to speak out against it and work to end it.
Yep. Yeah. And unfortunately, some people still don't think Islamophobia is a problem.
Right.
or outright deny it's a problem. And I know that's kind of the subject of one of your recent pieces for the website.
Yeah, a great segue there. So I'll try to breeze through this because we do have a number of things that we want to get to, and we certainly want you to tweet us your questions, and we are going to take some time at the end of the session to answer them and to interact with you. But another article that we recently published on the website was about this sort of this. I don't know how to quite characterize it, but there's this sort of phenomenon that exists where people would deny Islamophobia even exists. And so the point of the article was to say that denying Islamophobia is still Islamophobia. And basically what we pointed to was that there seems to be sort of this tendency among some people to want to mock the idea that this form of prejudice even exists. And there are a number of ways in which they do it. Chiefly among them is to put Islamophobia in quote marks as if to sort of seek to call it into question. Is this something that is real? Is this something that exists? People like Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer do that regularly, but also what they do is they call Islamophobia Islamophobe, F-A-U-X, as if to suggest that there's something fake about it. And most unfortunately, this has really sort of taken the internet and the social media world by storm. If you do a Google search for that word, you'll get thousands of results, among them from the aforementioned bloggers. But it has also made its way to the internet's, I think, most popular alternative to Webster, which is Urban Dictionary, right? And say what you will about it, but it carries a lot of weight among a lot of people. But it's really kind of a problem, especially when Muslims are the targets of attacks, and we've cited that here in various research reports that we've issued to suggest that this is not even something that's worthy of our consideration, that it's not real. And if we look at other forms of prejudice over the course of history, these types of narratives have existed too. I mean, people denied that anti-Semitism was something. People denied that racism existed or was a problem, all the while advocating policies and practices that were, I think, by most people's standards, certainly anti-Semitic and certainly racist. But in terms of what this means, it's really, as we point to in the piece, a sort of avenue by which these individuals who would deny Islamophobia seek to sort of inoculate themselves from criticism. So if they can say that this doesn't exist, then they have, then by criticizing Muslims in particularly problematic ways, by disparaging their religion, they can say, well, we're not Islamophobes. We're not advancing Islamophobic rhetoric because there's no such thing as Islamophobia. And in fact, there have been some social psychologists and others who have sort of looked at this phenomenon of denying prejudice in general, not only related to Islamophobia, but anti-Semitism, racism, and others. And two of them are Martha Augustinos and Danielle Every, and they write that in order to appear not prejudiced, it is important to present one's views as reasonable, rational, and thoughtfully arrived at. An effective way of doing this is to present one's views as reflecting the external world, rather than one's internal and therefore potentially racist psychology. So that's exactly what these people do. They say, well, we're not Islamophobic. We're just pointing to events in the Middle East. We're just pointing to this ISIS attack. We're just pointing to this episode of violence, and we're simply stating the facts. But of course, underlying all of this is sort of a more, I think, virulent strand of prejudice that exists, and is pretty clear from their writing and other work.
Yeah, well, and it's a shame because people are still getting brutally attacked. Just last week, I think a few days ago, a 59-year-old man, his name is Mohammed Rashid Khan, was beat up horribly in Queens, New York.
Right. He
had a concussion, a lot of bruises, broken ribs, and fractures in his face. I mean, the pictures of him in the hospital are really awful. And the American Muslim community and advocacy organizations are calling on law enforcement to investigate if it's a hate crime because, I'll read quickly, and I know we need to go to questions, but a quotation from a Council on American Islamic Relations press release, because it sort of describes the troubling picture. They write, because of the location of the attack outside a mosque, the Islamic attire of the victim, and because nothing was stolen by the alleged attackers, we urge law enforcement authorities to investigate a possible bias motive. He wasn't being robbed. He was wearing Muslim Muslim attire, was outside of a mosque, and so there's a lot of concerns that this could have had to do with his identity as a Muslim, and so
right.
It's really unfortunate that you have people that are calling attention to atrocities in some parts of the world or committed by some people while totally ignoring others. And it's not good because it leaves people uninformed and maybe even more prone to see Muslims as only aggressor and not ever as victims.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do want to take some questions. I know we have about 5 minutes or so left, and if you have questions, be sure to send them to us on Twitter. You can use our hashtag #BetweenTwoLamps. Our Twitter handle is @BridgeINIT. And so I think if we have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them and talk about them.
So we have a question from a follower on Facebook who wants to know if some of the interfaith efforts that were mentioned, if we've seen that it's been helping Muslims in America feel less scared.
I mean, as I'm not Muslim, so I can't speak. I don't want to speak for Muslims, but I would hope that I would hope that they're helping. I don't know. Do our people behind the camera have any responses to that too?
Yeah, well, it would just seem to me that that Islamophobia is such a big thing to tackle. It might not be helping at a macro level, but I can imagine that at a very micro level, in terms of communities feeling more connected locally, that's certainly something that can only help. It can't hurt.
Yeah, so I was at an iftar last night, an interfaith iftar, which was really, really great. It was run by Shoulder to Shoulder, United Muslim Relief, some other organizations, and there were 2 examples where panelists who were talking moved into a new neighborhood, and their neighbors came and knocked on their door, and I think both times it was during Ramadan, and they said Ramadan Kareem, happy Ramadan. And then invited them to an iftar, and they said it made them feel really welcome. And they had some fun stories to share about that. And I think in both cases they came from I think a Midwestern community and were coming to the East Coast, and so they were surprised that people even knew what Ramadan was, because I guess in their prior neighborhoods they were the only Muslims around, and a lot of people didn't know. So I think any time that non-Muslim communities reach out to Muslim neighbors or Muslim congregations, it only helps. It can't hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. Any more questions from social media world?
So a question about Muhammad Ali's passing. It was announced, I believe, late last night that President Barack Obama will not be attending the funeral.
Interesting.
And there were some questions about whether or not it's worth further analyzing that decision. Is Obama making a strategic decision to distance himself from a famous American Muslim whose funeral is being described as traditionally Islamic?
Yeah.
I don't know. I hadn't even heard that, actually.
I hadn't heard it either. I think that it's understandable how something like that could certainly raise concerns or questions, especially given that President Obama in the past, we know, has, especially in the campaign, sought to sort of distance himself from Muslims, because part of the attack against him from some people on the right was that he is a Muslim, and that is necessarily a bad thing. But I don't want to get into a whole lot of sort of political analyses here, because I'm not a pundit. But I guess my hunch is to say that it might not necessarily be so problematic. I mean, when you're a world leader like that, you're certainly going to experience times in which very high-profile people pass away, and you're not going to be able to make every single funeral. But I think that if we look at the statement that Barack Obama and Michelle Obama issued following Muhammad Ali's death, there's no doubt that he had the utmost respect and love and appreciation for him, and was someone that he admired greatly, so much so, in fact, that he has a pair of Muhammad Ali's boxing gloves and a portrait of Muhammad Ali, I think, knocking out, was it Sonny Liston or Joe Frazier, or whoever it was, but the sort of iconic picture in his personal study, which is just off the Oval Office.
Wow.
So there's that to take into consideration also.
Yeah, I'll be curious to read other people's interpretations of it, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of, as you said, analyses online.
There will be an awful lot of ways to interpret that and talk about it. We're getting close to the end here, but before we wrap up, we do want to end on a positive note, and that comes to us from Memorial Day weekend, in fact. And so over Memorial Day weekend, the ICNA conference, what is that? The Islamic Council of North America,
Circle.
The Islamic Circle of North America held their annual conference in Baltimore, and it ended up being an event that brought some 25,000 Muslims to the city from all across the country, really. And one of the things that came out of it was that there was this group effort to distribute these things called mercy bags. And these mercy bags were basically small kits that contained toiletries and other sort of daily necessities to homeless people in Baltimore. And the inspiration for the mercy bags actually came not from a desire to combat Islamophobia. It wasn't an effort on the part of the American Muslim community to sort of push back against Islamophobia, but it came from Freddie Gray's death, and how in the aftermath of that, in the wake of his death at the hands of Baltimore police, protests eventually led to looting, where people would steal from convenience stores many of these sort of basic daily items that they needed in order to survive. And so some of the Muslims that were at the conference came up with the idea to simply put together these kits and distribute them to the people that needed them. And they wanted to do something that benefited the community that was hosting them, and a community that has a fairly substantial number of homeless people. Homelessness in Baltimore is a real problem, as it is here in D.C. And there was a quote from a woman, I'll just read it before we wrap up. A 68-year-old Baltimore resident named Katie Crowder was asked about this effort. And here's what she said. Quote, "They're doing what's in their heart. If everybody stopped judging one another, they'd be a lot better off. It'd be a better world, I'm telling you." And so here you see, presumably, just an ordinary resident of Baltimore looking outward at what's happening and the work that the Muslim community is doing there, and recognizing that at the end of the day, we are all people that have more in common than we have we have more in common than we have in difference. And so that's sort of a positive way to wrap up, I thought, and certainly an inspiring story out of Baltimore.
Yeah. So if you have ideas for things that we can talk about in future sessions of Between Two Lamps, please let us know. We'd love to get your suggestions for things to talk about in future episodes. So thank you for joining us for our third session of Between Two Lamps. Don't forget to continue using the hashtag and follow us on Twitter. And these videos will be up and you can share them in the future as well. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks for being with us. Bye.
Chit chat. Okay. Can you do that?
Out loud?
Out loud, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Jesus.
Like real chit chat, or just like
That's what he means.
Appropriate chit chat.
That's
not like how's the weather, but just like what do you think?